Hi everyone, it's Kimberly Ashton here from Autism Oxford. I hope you're well. I work here at Autism Oxford as the CEO, but also as an autism consultant nurse. Today I wanted to talk to you about ADHD assessments and what a good ADHD assessment looks like particularly. As a mum of two neurodivergent individuals, it was a real challenge for me looking for an ADHD assessment independently and knowing what good looked like. But also, if I'm accessing an assessment through the NHS, is knowing what to expect and what good looks like there as well. Now, most of you will know from the media, there is a huge extensive waiting list and huge demand for ADHD assessments for all ages, as our awareness of what ADHD actually means increases, and also our acceptance of ADHD increases as well. Now, what this has led to is us developing different ways of approaching an ADHD assessment so we can support the demand that we're seeing. Now, this means we can see still some outstanding practice happen, but we can see sometimes that practice is adapted to a point where actually it's not always necessarily reliable. So I'm hoping this video will help you understand what good would look like, to help you kind of think about what type of service is right for you, but also if you're accessing an NHS service, to what you should expect from your NHS service. So if you think you or your loved one is ADHD, you are likely to see some hyperactivity or impulsivity or inattention. This may look like a young person struggling to sit still or remain seated in class. In adulthood, it might be actually it's really hard to stay focused on a task for a long period of time and I'm needing to get up and move out of my seat, for example. ADHD is lifelong. We can see the ADHD symptoms change over the lifespan as well. So sometimes people feel like their ADHD is not quite so prevalent, but it doesn't disappear completely. It's usually still in the background. Other things that can impact and influence your ADHD kind of characteristics and prevalence, I suppose, in how much it's impacting you in your everyday living is also hormone changes as well. Now we can see this in puberty, we can see this in pregnancy, and we can also see this perimenopausal and in menopause as well. So again, we can see it impact across lifelong, particularly for women as well. Now, ADHD, if we were assessing it a good 5-10 years ago, we would be looking at ADHD and something that was called ADD, so Attention Deficit Disorder. The new diagnostic manual revision now clumps that in together, so we now look at ADHD and it breaks it down into 3 predominant types. So you have ADHD inattentive type, we have ADHD hyperactivity and impulsivity type, and then we have ADHD combined type. Now, the reason behind doing this is to try and to acknowledge that actually I might have ADHD inattentive type predominantly, but it doesn't mean I don't have no symptoms related to hyperactivity. It just means that actually my hyperactivity symptoms are not as many or as severe enough to hit the criteria for the combined type, for example. Now, ADHD, we are really looking at those key characteristics before the age of 12. The diagnostic criteria requires us to do this. So if we're assessing in adulthood, we're looking at before the age of 12. So if we're going in school years in the UK, that's usually around year 7, year 8, and probably all the way through primary school. And then we're looking at in adulthood, so how that comparable is happening. If we're assessing a young person, we're looking at still before the age of 12, those kind of characteristics being prevalent and having that impact, but we're also kind of looking much more deeply across the whole of the kind of education sector, so primary and secondary school, and then potentially into university, depending on where the young person is in their life journey. Now, NICE, which the National Institute of Care and Excellence, this is in the UK what we follow to tell us what good practice looks like, so what a good assessment would look like. Now, NICE is really clear in its guidance to health professionals that for an ADHD assessment we should be doing a full developmental history. Now that needs to include family history, so if there's a genetic disposition to being ADHD, we need to make sure we're looking at that. We're looking at development history, so looking at pregnancy, looking at the birth, and then looking in those early years as well. We should be taking a full medical history, so we know that ADHD often occurs with other medical conditions, So we need to be looking out for those, for clues that ADHD might be present, but also making sure we're not missing any other diagnoses as well that we need to consider. And then we should be taking a full educational and employment history if you're in adulthood. And an educational history needs to be very thorough, because actually we need to be evidencing that these characteristics are across at least 2 settings. Now, we have people who contact us and go, well, yeah, but you know, my young person is home educated, or I was home educated, so that second setting is not so readily available. And that's absolutely fine. We shouldn't be discriminating home ed children and young people by then saying, well, we can't provide a diagnosis. We do hear this from some providers that will say we can't provide a diagnosis because we don't have the second setting. But actually the second setting, excuse me, can be any setting. It doesn't have to be school. Now, we often use school because we're looking for impact also across multiple settings, and one of those is education. So it's easier for us to look at a school because we can look at the impact on education and to see whether it's prevalent in that setting as well. So it's usually the easier setting to look at, but it doesn't mean it should be the only one. Some of the other settings we can look at are after school clubs. It could be hobbies, activities that the person is using. It could be another family member they spend a lot of time with. For example, if you're co-parenting with grandparents, for example, we can often use that as a second setting as well. To add in an extra layer to have some subjectivity in it, we also use what's called a QB test or a QB check. Now, the QB check is done online and you do it from your own laptop, and the QB test is often done in clinic when you come to see someone. Now, the QB test is much more detailed than a QB check, but will give us the same similar sort of information of an overview whether someone is ADHD, hyperactive, or impulsive, or inattentive. This provides a separate kind of valid subjective view on the clinical formulation, so it can be really, really helpful to add that into an assessment. Now, not all services will use a QB check or QB test, so it's always worth asking them if they do. Sometimes people only use these as a second line as part of the assessment, so if they've completed that development history and got information from that second setting and it's still not sure, it's unclear, then they may only add in a QB check or QB test. Some services like ours, we do it as standard, we make it as part of the assessment process because it helps us give a very holistic picture across the whole view, and it means that we hopefully don't miss anyone or we avoid any kind of misdiagnosis then as well. Now, the QB is one part, the development history I've already talked about. Then the next part of an ADHD assessment is we look at using a tool called the Diva or the Young Diva if you're a young person. Now, this is just one tool that NICE recommends. There are other tools as well that people can use, but this is when we're looking at what we call the core symptoms of ADHD. I hate the word symptoms, but that's what the diagnostic manual uses. Now, there are 9 for inattention and there's 9 for hyperactivity and impulsivity that we look at. Now, it's not to say that ADHD doesn't cause or we don't relate with any other characteristics or preferences or difficulties. We know it absolutely does. For example, executive functioning, so managing my emotional regulation or sequencing. We know those things are often difficult or different for our ADHD community. Similarly, as sensory experiences are often different as well for our ADHD community. However, they're often not explored within that core symptom counter, as we call it. So we have the 9 for inattention that we go through, and then if you're a young person, we're looking for 6 or more of those to be able to consider a diagnosis, and we need to have 6 or more across those multiple settings. We're doing the same for hyperactivity and impulsivity. We're looking for 6 or more across both of those settings. And then if you're an adult, we're looking for 5 or more. Now, it's not to say that you need to be less ADHD in adulthood to get a diagnosis. That's not what that does. What that does is actually we're looking at it's not always so prevalent in childhood as it is in adulthood, some of the kind of scaffolding and strategies that might be used, because we've had longer to develop those in adulthood. So often then in childhood those difficulties are much more overt, whereas in adulthood we've developed those strategies. So we're exploring that in more detail. Once we've kind of gone through those core symptoms, we should always be looking at the person holistically and thinking about that wider impact, but also looking at all those secondary characteristics that are not part of the diagnosis but are important to think about for our recommendations and formulation. Now we need to then think about the impact we're having. So I've already mentioned about the impact in education, but we're also looking at the impact on family life, and we're also looking at the impact in peer relationships, and also self-esteem and well-being as well. Now we need to see that impact across multiple areas of life to have a diagnosis of ADHD. And this is one of the things I think as a parent it can be a bit confusing, because I could have 6 or more symptoms of inattention, for example, but still not receive a diagnosis because actually it's not impacting me across multiple settings, and or it's not impacting across multiple areas of my life. So that can sometimes feel quite frustrating, because you're like, well, actually, just because I've got good support in place, sometimes that's the reason why the impact's not necessarily there or not been explored in detail, means that sometimes it can be a barrier to a diagnosis. Now, that's a lot of information we're gathering, so we pull all that together. Now, good practice is that assessment then should always be at least discussed with a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist or a paediatrician with specialist knowledge and training in ADHD, if they're not the ones who have carried out the assessment. My view would always be that you should always have at least 2 health professionals involved in that assessment, so whether it's a peer support practitioner and a clinician, and then or a clinical psychologist, or it's a clinician and a clinical psychologist. There should be 2 people at least reviewing that as good clinical practice. Once we do that, we can then provide a report, and you should get a report from any service that you've been involved in, and that should give you a good summary of how you've met that criteria, because that report's going to follow you around for the rest of your life. It's great if it's a clinical letter, but we need to detail how you've met that criteria so it can't be challenged later on in life. It's really important that we give that information. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be really lengthy, and lengthy reports does not always equal best quality reports, but it does need to detail how you've met that criteria. We then should be putting recommendations in place. It's the so what bit, which is the whole reason you come for an assessment in the first place, right? It's the so what bit. So it might be helping with accessing education or sitting an exam. It might be actually support with developing and identifying how I manage my emotional states. It might be help with how I manage and navigate those peer relationships, or a romantic relationship in adulthood. It could be with challenges and how I support employment. And actually all those the recommendations should reflect all those areas of life, and there should be strategies put in place there or signposting around that could be really, really helpful. I hope that's been really helpful for you. There's a lot of information in this video. If you have any questions, you can always contact us here at Autism Oxford. Our team are always welcome questions, so you can either give us a call or you can drop us an email. Our email is assessments@autismoxford.org.uk.